Start by blessing the food so you can eat, and I would like to introduce our Vice President for Student Services, Dr. Jeff Pittman, who will say the blessing for us. Oh, and before we bless, we will be giving away some door prizes today. This is John Ashcroft's latest book, so you definitely want to stick around until the end of the session. We'll be giving away about a dozen or 15 copies of this at the end of the session. So Dr. Pittman, please bless our food.
Thank you, ma'am. Please join with me in prayer. Thank you, Father. Lord, we thank you for this day and this place, this campus where we trust your Holy Spirit walks daily. And Father, today as we gather to think about the foundations of this country and the firm foundation that you've given us in the Constitution, Father, in this representative government we have, we're reminded of that certainly, but we're also reminded of the firm foundation we have in Christ. And so, Father, as we gather today, as we think about the country you've given us, what we are and what we can be, we praise your name. And we'd ask your blessings on this food and each one here today, and certainly this institution. We'd ask it all in the powerful name of Christ. Amen. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Randall Pennell, who's not only a biblical scholar, an Old Testament and biblical languages scholar, but also a dear friend and our Vice President for Academic Affairs.
Thank you. Thank you. We want you to go ahead and eat and go through the lines and all of that, so we're going to move right along with our program. So do not let anything that I say impede you from either getting your food in line or feeding your face at this moment. You have permission and blessing. Recently, I read an article concerning a curriculum for tomorrow's citizens by Harry Lewis in the Chronicle for Higher Education. It talks about the current circumstance in which much of our citizenry, as well as many recent college graduates, are ignorant of the basic principles on which the U.S. government runs. There have been two reports, The Coming Crisis in Citizenship by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute and Losing America's Memory, commissioned by the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, that have documented this problem. Fewer than half the seniors in college surveyed knew that the Bill of Rights prohibits Congress from establishing an official national religion. Fewer than a third knew what, quote, Reconstruction was, and fewer than a third knew what the Voting Rights Act was, or that the Voting Rights Act was part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Only 60% could identify the Constitution as the document dividing powers between the states and the federal government. We might say that students entering college should already understand basic American institutions so that we in the university and colleges could blame secondary schools for not having done the job. But we cannot say that. Civic ignorance is not just the problem of high schools. It's our problem. Honoring the responsibilities of citizenship in a democracy is, in my opinion, part of the moral obligation universities assume in exchange for the vast freedoms and tax exemptions that we enjoy. Institutions of higher education like ours have a social contract with America, and we have not always done our part. We owe it to our country to teach our students how democracy works. As Harry Lewis writes in his article, more is at issue here than the dates in American history. What is needed is to develop a feeling for the preciousness of human freedom and self-determination, and the responsibility of citizens to act for the good of their country and not only in their personal self-interest. Our students must learn somewhere how America's foundational ideas of liberty and equality under the law apply to the difficult problems with which it is struggling today. They need to know that as citizens we have no one but ourselves to blame for our elected officials and their actions. As Lewis reminds us, a successful democracy demands that these traits and outlooks be shared as far as possible among all the people. Democracy is not merely a system of government, but in part it is a spiritual ideal. Of all the forms of government, democracy most demands an educated, thoughtful citizenry. If we don't impart this legacy, our children will not merely be able to inherit our nationhood. They can receive it only through learning. So we welcome you today to this Constitution Day luncheon and the awesome panel that we have assembled here. We bless you and for this great opportunity for us to learn more about what our roles as citizens and as Christians in our culture are. Let me introduce Bill McGee from the Law Library, who will moderate the panel discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Pinnell. Good afternoon, and welcome to the panel discussion as to whether our Constitution can survive terrorism. Before we begin, let me outline today's program and set some ground rules. Probably the first and most important ground rule is that you may get up and get seconds if you want at any point of the program. So please keep that in mind. I will introduce each panel member before they speak. And could you also shut off cell phones as well? That would be great too. Each member will be allowed no more than 8 minutes to talk. And once the panel finishes, there will be a question and answer period. Unfortunately today, former Attorney General John Ashcroft could not be with us, but he did send a videotape. And before we view that videotape, let me say a few things about General Ashcroft. General Ashcroft was appointed by President Bush after President Bush won the election. And as you all remember, there was a bit of a legal controversy as to who was president. Was it Gore or was it Bush? So there was a little bit of delay trying to get up and running in the administration. Well, can you imagine, as of September 2001, dealing with all the problems that a U.S. Attorney General has to deal with, such as any sort of federal crimes, as being with drugs, immigration, and so forth. September 11th happens. Now, your job doesn't, everything else that you've been doing doesn't stop. It keeps going. And now you have to deal with a brand new crisis that faces the country. There probably hasn't been an attorney general who's had to face such a crisis as Edward Bates, who served under Abraham Lincoln, who ironically is also from Missouri. So without further ado, let's see what General Ashcroft has to say about terrorism in the Constitution.
Two centuries and a score of years ago today, the Constitution being signed launched the Republic into a future which could scarcely have been anticipated by those who crafted the document. It was a time when technology was something at a very limited level. It certainly didn't approach the kinds of capacities we have today. The Constitution was designed to provide for a nation and to provide for the governance of the nation and the defense of the nation. And it is important and appropriate for us to ask questions about to what extent do the exigencies or the realities of modernity fit with the wisdom of the Constitution. And I'm delighted to be a part of that kind of examination and to join the distinguished panel of individuals who will be answering that question today. Let me just say that at the time the Constitution was signed, black powder was one of the most destructive substances known to man. But a person carrying a satchel of black powder into the room might kill a few of the people and injure a few more, and give the rest a headache. A person carrying the same size instrumentality now filled with evil biology, biological weapons, or evil chemistry, chemical weapons, or heaven forbid, nuclear capacity might literally challenge the existence of a city or a region. The destructive capacity of mankind has skyrocketed in the presence of technology. And how does the Constitution meet that? Fortunately, the founders allowed for the defense of the nation in a context of flexibility and agility. And many of the rules of the Constitution are expressed with relative specificity. But the powers of the president, the executive, to defend the country are implied. And in implied powers, you can find the flexibility, the elasticity, if you will, for the Constitution to accommodate new circumstances. Now, there are powers that relate to the defense of the country, the power to raise an army and the power to have rules and regulations regarding it that fall to the Congress. And one of the problems we face is when the rules promulgated or enacted by the Congress, signed into law by the President, might conflict with the responsibility of the President to defend the country, or the implied power of the President to do so under Article 2 of the Constitution. This tension that can come up between Article 3 powers exercised by the Congress, which are relatively specific, and Article 2 powers exercised by the President, which are a result of implication in the Constitution, sometimes causes us to have the greatest interest and the most interesting law cases. Obviously, there is a need to be able to defend the country. As one Supreme Court justice said, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. It does not require us to cling to ideas which will cause us to cease to exist. So presidents are said to have very broad powers, that their implied powers are the implied powers to defend the Constitution and to defend the country itself. One Supreme Court justice once asked the question, how much power does the president have, the executive have, to defend the country? And he said, enough to defend it, or enough to win in a war. Very few of us would suggest that the implied powers of the president are only robust enough to almost win the war and for the country to go out of existence. The real challenges come when the Congress has legislated in an area, like the area of surveillance, and the president has some implied powers in an area like the area of surveillance. And what happens if those powers collide? Those are the kinds of questions that law schools examine and that lawyers and scholars can debate, but ultimately are resolved in circumstances that relate to the survival of the democracy. We've seen that as we have tried to accommodate the defense of the nation to the threat of terrorism, where not only is technology expanding the ability of individuals to pose threats, we now have to watch out for very small groups of individuals, not just competing nations, because small groups and individuals can actually threaten our democracy. So it's important that we ask and answer the question about the Constitution, which we're all discussing today. Can the Constitution survive the threat of terrorism? And obviously, I believe it can.
Okay, our first speaker today is retired Admiral Vernon Clark. He currently serves as a distinguished professor in the School of Government and Leadership since 2005. He has served with the Navy for 37 years, retiring in 2005. He has been the Chief of Naval Operations and has been on the Joint Chiefs of Staffs, who advises the President as to military matters. He was also the second longest serving Chief of Naval Operations in the U.S. Navy's history. In 2002, he charted a course for maximizing human capital in the Navy, resulting in the best recruitment and longest retention in the U.S. Navy's history. He has been awarded numerous medals, 4 awards for the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, 3 for the Navy Distinguished Medal, 3 awards of Legion of Merit, 2 Distinguished Service Medals received from both the Army and the Air Force, and a number of international awards from Germany, Italy, France, South Korea, Japan, Portugal, Singapore, and the Netherlands. He received his undergraduate degree at Evangel College in Springfield, Missouri. He also received his MBA at University of Arkansas. He holds 3 honorary degrees, one from the University of Toledo, the other from Northwest University, and another from Old Dominion University, which, if you don't know, is right down the road from us. He serves on the board of directors for the Raytheon Company. He also serves for the Rolls-Royce North America and the Stanford Research Institute International, and he also serves on the executive committee for military ministry. He's on the World Board of Governors for the USO, which is the entertainment organizations for servicemen and women. And he is also a Board of Visitor for the Regent University. Would you please give a warm welcome to retired Admiral Vernon Clark?
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a real privilege to be back on campus again. It's been a few weeks since we've been here, and I relish the chance to discuss ideas and share in the debate. The question put to me today was, how has terrorism, as we know it today, impacted naval operations, and can, of course, because of all of that, can the Constitution survive terrorism? Well, as you might imagine, I've had a fairly decent seat in this arena. Somebody might say up close and personal. Let's talk first about the effect of things. In 1994, late in the year, I flew back into town and took over a position as the Deputy Commander of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. It was a wonderful time in our history. The Cold War was over, the wall had come down, and we were very optimistic about things. As the deputy of all of the Navy on the east of the Mississippi, we had ideas about the way that we could make things better and more adaptable to the environment that we found ourselves in. In fact, we had this radical idea that the Navy belonged to the people of the United States of America, and that it was high time we broke down the barriers and opened the gates. And so the commander in that day and time decided that we were going to do something that hadn't been done for 100 years, and that was to open the gates and to make the nation's the treasure that the taxpayers of America had invested in, to make it open to them so they could all see it. In 1997, I was here 3 years in 2 jobs, and in 1997 I went to Washington, D.C., and I was assigned a position as the Director for Operations on the Joint Staff, and fundamentally that meant that I was the operations officer for the United States military. That experience and the time in which we were serving, the things that we were able to observe, had a profound impact, influence on the way I thought about the world that we lived in. In fact, in 1999, when I was ordered back here to now become the commander of the United States Atlantic Fleet, my management approach is to create as much focus as you can in a large organization. That is sometimes a challenge. And what we did, we created a top 5 to help all of us collectively focus on the challenges that we needed to tackle. On my top 5 was something that had not appeared before in our time, and it was item number 2 on the list was force protection. It became clear to me, based upon the intelligence that I was able to observe in my day-to-day life in late 94, 95, and 96, and most of 1997. I came down here late in the year, I'm sorry, 97, 98, and 99, and I came down here in mid-99. It became clear to me that the environment and the landscape had changed completely. My predecessor had locked the gates again, but we set out to ensure that we would prepare our forces more effectively to deal with the global challenge that they were facing then and would face in the days to come. And then, of course, in July of the year 2000, I became the Chief of the Navy and went back to Washington. I run through that just to say that, and I've talked to classes here about that experience, that 3 months after I had the job, I had this incredible experience. At 5 minutes till 6 in the morning, on the 12th of October, I got a call from my commander in Bahrain. To many people in the United States of America, the real global war on terror started on 9/11. For those of us in the Navy, it didn't at all. It started on October 12th when the Al-Qaeda attacked the United States ship Cole in Aden. And I'll never forget that call, because that call relayed to me, not from the ship, but from the commander, that the ship had been attacked. And when we came to understand the full meaning of all this, it was clear that we were living in a new time. The next day, I did all the talk shows, and this is in response to the question put forward to me, and what influence and impact has this had upon us? After the talk shows, I was sitting in my office late in the day. It's about 4 o'clock, and it became clear to me that we could take the conventional approach and we could study this and do a major investigation that would take 3 to 6 months and then decide what we were going to do. That afternoon, I sat down at my computer and I typed a message to the United States Navy. And I said to them that day, all of the things that we have assumed up to now, we must challenge. Clearly, we believed, as I had experienced in my Navy life, that it was safe for us to drive one of our ships into any port in the world because we believed in international law and the community of nations. We believed in the natural defense that we assumed because of the existence of those articles and a set of beliefs. And that we put our commanders at great risk in believing that it was safe for them to take their ship and their crews into places that did not belong to the United States of America, and that we had little and sometimes no information about what the real security posture was in the nation. And I said, from this day forward, we will never do that again. And commencing at that point in time, the security apparatus put into place globally to protect the resources that belong to the United States of America changed everything that we believed about our safety around the world and everything about the way we practiced our movements in the world. If you are attempting to get on base to visit something today, you know that it's difficult to get on. By the way, the other day, I came in and I had a rental car and I needed to go on base. And I pulled up to the gate and I flashed them my 4-star Admiral ID card, and they said, "Where is your sticker?" And so I got in line with everybody else and I obtained one so that I could conduct my business on the base. Everything has changed for us. And my philosophy and the guidance that I gave to people was, we want to make it as easy as possible for those who have to be there every day on our bases to get there easily and smoothly. And we want to make it as difficult as possible for anybody else. And so being a visitor fell into that category, and I got to enjoy the fruits of my beliefs. I close with this thought. The question is, can our nation survive and the Constitution survive terrorism? You see, I believe that the Constitution, as John Ashcroft said, was built upon a set of principles and values. And I believe that in the course of events, we will see adjustments made to the manner in which we apply a set of practices and procedures. But I believe, as has already been said by Dr. Pinnell, that the principles in the Constitution are based upon a set of beliefs that we find that link themselves very nicely with our religious beliefs. And the power to choose, and which is what freedom is all about, the principles that are embedded in the Constitution must always be protected at any cost. I do believe that when we face new and different challenges, the asymmetric world in which we live, we face an enemy that will not step into the ring and go toe-to-toe with us ever again. That's not the way it's going to be. Ever again in the future, it will never be like it was in the past. We have a tendency in the military to always fight yesteryear's war. We have to make sure that we don't do that in the future. But however we go at it, we must ensure that we protect the ideals, the values, the principles that make freedom possible for us fortunate enough to live in this wonderful land called the United States of America. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Clark. Our next speaker is Dr. Charles Niemeyer. He is a professor at the Robertson School of Government, and he's been with us since 1994. He has been the academic dean for the School of Government and the executive director for the Alexandria campus. He received his undergraduate degree at the University of Maryland and has a slew of master or postgraduate degrees. He has a Master of Arts from the National Security and Strategic Studies from the Naval War College. He also has a Master of Arts of History from Georgetown University. He received his doctorate in American History from the same institution. He has been the Dean of Academics at the Naval War College and has taught at such institutions as Valley Forge Military Academy and College, the U.S. Naval Academy, and the University of Central Oklahoma. He's written numerous articles on history and national security affairs, and he has also served in the military, 20 years in the Marine Corps, and he's also currently serving as the Marine Corps' military historian. Would you please welcome Dr. Niemeyer?
Well, thank you very much. There's an old saying in show business, they used to say that never follow acts that involve children or animals, and I will add chiefs of naval operations, because anything I can say will certainly pale next to Admiral Clark's. This afternoon, it's now the afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit briefly about the U.S. Constitution, national security, and how it's and the impact of terrorism on that particular document. And one of the things that I was reminded of when Admiral Clark was speaking, and for anybody else out there that has ever served in the military, is that when you take your commission or your oath of office, the first thing you do is you raise your hand and say, "You solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic." We don't say support and defend the President of the United States. We don't say support and defend Congress. We say the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So in my 8 minutes, I want to touch briefly upon 4 major points that talks a little bit about this vis-a-vis national security and the Constitution and the impact of the global war on terror on our civil liberties and also our constitutional liberties as designed in the Constitution. And there's 4 points I want to touch on that I think is important that we bring into perspective as we talk about the Constitution today, and that is the presidential war powers that are enumerated under Article 2 and Section 1 of the Constitution, Section 2 of the Constitution as well. And essentially, it provides the President of the United States and makes him Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. And the reason why we have this particular section of the Constitution is because, in fact, the Articles of Confederation weren't working out real well. How do you deal with a foreign threat? How do you deal with a domestic threat like the Shays Rebellion that occurred in western Massachusetts? There was no army to raise. There was no ability to put down the rebellion. Later on, after the Constitution is drafted, there's a challenge to national sovereignty by France in the Quasi-War, where we established, no kidding, a real national security structure. The first 6 frigates of the United States Navy are built just prior to the Quasi-War with France. So the presidential war powers are designed to give the president the authority to act in emergencies in particular. And that's what I see us doing right now, is the president is acting in an emergency state. The problem with this particular emergency is that it's an emergency that almost is boundless, that it's an open-ended sort of crisis that we've entered in the 21st century that I don't see ending in the next 5, 10, 20, perhaps even our own lifetimes. This global struggle and the war on terror will go on, and it's important for us to understand that the president is empowered with certain powers under the Constitution to act in a crisis. Now, the problem we have with this first point that I wanted to make is that Article 2 is specifically written as vague, and is purposely done this way. Cecil Crabb and Dean Dunn is familiar with this book. He wrote a book on constitutional powers, and Crabb says that the Constitution is specifically designed as an invitation to struggle between the branches of government. So in other words, while the president says, I'm the commander-in-chief and I'm in charge of the armed forces, the Congress says, but we have something to say about that as well. And sometimes the courts will also weigh in. And that brings me up to the next point that I wanted to make. So point number 1 is that the president has war powers under the Constitution. Point number 2 is that in 1973, there was an attempt by Congress to define just how far those war powers went, and it was called the War Powers Resolution. Now, as every act that's passed by Congress and everything that we understand about our nation and our constitutional development is always influenced by the politics of the time. The War Powers Resolution was influenced by the post-Vietnam era and the beginning of the Watergate crisis that we had in this country, and the Congress was attempting to rein in a president's power to commit U.S. armed forces overseas in foreign combat. And as a result, they placed requirements and stipulations on the ability of Congress to use his power as commander-in-chief. Now, it's important to note that while Congress will insist that the War Powers Resolution has standing in law, no U.S. presidents at the time of Richard Nixon's veto of the War Powers Resolution, which was overridden by Congress in 1973, no president has ever admitted that the War Powers Resolution has any bearing on them in specific ways. However, each president has gone out of their way to avoid a constitutional crisis over taking on Congress over the War Powers Resolution. Thus, you saw President George Bush Sr. going to Congress and asking for permission to eject Saddam Hussein's forces from Kuwait in 1990, actually, and then we did the attack in 1991. And by the way, it passed by one single vote in the United States Senate. And that's such a close-run thing. So the second part was War Powers Resolution. Now, since 9/11, we've seen two other major pieces of legislation come along that's important to talk about. And one was designed chiefly by the person you saw on the TV just a minute ago, and that's the Patriot Act. Now, the Patriot Act has been much debated and much talked about. It has a lot of controversy. It enables the president to do, and the law enforcement agencies of this country to do a lot of things. But essentially, it increases the ability of law enforcement to search telephone and email communications, medical records, financial records, and other records, and eases restrictions on foreign intelligence gathering within the United States, expands the Secretary of the Treasury's authority to regulate financial transactions, particularly those involving foreign individuals and entities, and it enhances the discretion of law enforcement and immigration authorities in detaining and deporting immigrants suspected of terrorism-related acts. Again, the U.S. Patriot Act was an important tool in the President's arsenal in the global war on terror. Nonetheless, it did receive numerous court challenges, and in fact, one particular section, Section 505 of the Patriot Act, was attacked by the courts and struck down as being unconstitutional. This had to do with national security letters being issued allowing search and seizure of persons and their private property and their private records without any recourse to a federal court. And so that's an important thing. That's still being debated in the courts. The last point I wanted to talk about is probably one of the more important pieces of legislation to come down in a long time. And this is something that Congress and the courts asked for. And it's called the Military Commissions Act of 2006. How do you define this new enemy that's out there? In the old days, when we had an enemy go to war, they wore uniforms, they had national capitals, they had ambassadors, they had diplomacy, they had diplomats you could negotiate with, you could get a settlement. There is no way to negotiate with Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Moreover, they don't wear uniforms. They try to blend in with the local population. So this is an important point to remember. So this Military Commissions Act is going to enable the U.S. military to detain and imprison terrorists and those suspected of committing terrorist acts and being tried by a military tribunal, vice having access to civil criminal courts. Again, this pertains specifically to non-U.S. citizens. There was a single case is still being argued of a U.S. citizen who was detained under this particular legislation, Jose Patilla, and he was actually later, this was actually then tried by a civil court in, I believe, South Carolina, and he was sent back to jail, as he should have been. So basically, there you have it in a nutshell, and I'll get off the stage because I know I'm nearing my 8 minutes, I think. So essentially what I want to say is these four things: the Presidential War Powers Act under Article 2 of the Constitution, later amended by the U.S. Congress, which no president has admitted has any bearing on them, but no president has dared violate because they don't want the constitutional court fight, the War Powers Resolution. The third thing that we have and the fourth thing that we have in our arsenal right now are two important pieces of legislation that have amended what we can do under the Constitution, and that is the Patriot Act. I do want to point out in the Patriot Act there is a built-in sunset clause. A sunset clause for those law students out there are something that automatically requires a review after a number of years pass by to ensure that the law is doing what they want it to do. I think we've been very successful in not abusing the Patriot Act and being very careful about who gets charged and who gets arrested under this particular bit of legislation. And the fourth act that we have here, the Military Commissions Act of 2006, asked for by the courts, designed by Congress, signed by the president, gives the president authority to detain terrorists and try them by military tribunal without having to go through a court system where they would be tied up for years in federal court or local courts. So thank you very much for inviting me. Again, it's always a pleasure to be back at Regent University. I'd like to say hello to my friends out there. I've missed them the past year I've been up at Quantico. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Niemeyer. Our next speaker is Professor Jeffries, who is currently with the Robertson School of Government. She received her undergraduate degree at Grove City College, and her graduate work includes the Arabic Language Institute from the American University in Cairo, and she's currently earning her PhD at Boston University in political science. She specializes in Middle Eastern politics, and her academic focus is upon the relationship between religion and political violence, terrorism and American foreign policy, security policy development, and she also has an intermediate advanced level of knowledge of speaking Arabic. Would you please welcome Professor Jeffries?
So growing up, I had this thing for Aesop's fables, and I thought it was such a brilliant form of manipulation. You tell this lovely little story and then add what is usually a tragic ending to subtly make an important point to an innocent audience. So I would write fables of my own and use them to communicate my dissatisfaction with various family policies in a way that I thought was simultaneously clever and subtle. But developments at recent family reunions where my sisters have said things like, "Jenny, you were such a weird child growing up," has led me to wonder whether I really ever mastered the art of writing the fable. But I'm still inclined to believe that in hands more masterful than my own, fables are a terrific method of communication. So for that reason, I was excited to come across an interesting adaptation of Aesop's The Boy Who Cried Wolf, when I was preparing for this panel. It's pretty short, so I want to read it with you right now. There was once a boy king who was bored as he sat in the palace watching his subjects walk down the street. To amuse himself, he took a great breath and sang out, "Terror, terror, Al-Qaeda is planning to kill you." The subjects came running to help the boy king drive the terrorists away, but when they arrived, they found no terrorists. The boy king laughed at the sight of their scared faces. "Please don't cry terrorists, sire," said the subjects. When there is no terrorists, they went grumbling back to their business. Later, the boy sang out again, "Terror, terror, Al-Qaeda is trying to kill you." To his naughty delight, he watched his subjects cower in fright. At the same time, he summoned his court and signed decrees to take away their liberties. When the subjects again saw no real terrorist threat, they sternly said, "Save your frightened song, for when there is something really wrong, don't cry terrorists when there is no terrorist." But the boy king just grinned and watched them go grumbling back to their business. Later, he saw a real threat to his subjects. Alarmed, he leapt to his feet and sang out as loudly as he could, "Terrorists, terrorists!" But the subjects thought he was trying to fool them again, and so they didn't react. When the attack finally came, the people went up into the palace to find the boy king weeping. "There really was a terrorist here. I cried out, 'Terrorist!' Why didn't you listen?" An old man tried to comfort the boy king as they surveyed the damage. Nobody believes a liar, even when he's telling the truth. Embroiled in Iraq, in search of nuclear weapons, fighting a civil war, the point of this fable is not hard to grasp. The author is arguing that our boy king, George W. Bush, has out of boredom deliberately identified terror when none is to be found, simply to watch American citizens scramble around in fear. As someone that actually voted for George Bush twice and watched the Twin Towers fall onto New York City, I can't accept that he's taken this present path out of boredom and in pursuit of malicious pleasure. But this doesn't let us off the hook necessarily. There have been situations in the last 6 years where fear, perhaps not maliciously, but certainly inaccurately, has been used to generate support for actions that might not otherwise have been taken. Our question today is, can the Constitution survive terrorism? And the question wouldn't be all that perplexing if the Constitution were nothing more than a piece of paper and terrorism nothing more than non-state-sponsored attempts to cause physical harm. The likelihood of terrorists breaking into the National Archives and physically destroying our original Constitution is low, and thus we can conclude we speak today of the Constitution, we're talking about more than a piece of parchment. So before we go any further, I want to make sure we reach an agreement about what this document is before we try and figure out whether or not it can be destroyed by terrorism. So I'm not going to spend any time today talking about the intentions of our fathers or the nature of the Constitution as a living or non-living document. My background is not really in American government or constitutional law, and there are attorneys, admirals, professors here that could speak far more intelligently on this issue than I. But I do want to point out something that I've noticed a lot as a student of political science. It's interesting to me that the Constitution is often represented as being the source of rights for American citizens, when really it's nothing of the sort. If you look even quickly at the Bill of Rights, you'll notice that everything is framed in the negative. So Congress shall pass no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The right of the people to be secure in their houses, persons, and effects against unreasonable seizures shall not be violated. The framers of the Constitution understood that rights were granted by God. The purpose of the Constitution, then, is to see that those rights are not violated. This is seen clearly in the Bill of Rights, but it's still manifest in the philosophical understanding that pervades the rest of the document. The Constitution was not written to create government, but to articulate its limitations and to protect citizens from its encroachment. So this conception of our Constitution allows us to reframe the question at hand from can the Constitution survive terrorism to in what ways does terrorism threaten our articulation of our rights and the limitations of our government. Any introductory level course on terrorism will tell you that, or an introductory level course in international relations will tell you that terrorism is guided by two motivations. The first is to cause extensive physical harm, often to civilians, and this is measured in death counts and body bags. But the second is a lot more hard to measure and is far more intangible. It's to evoke fear, to damage security, to wreak havoc, emotional, social, economic, and to undermine a nation's faith in their government. The devastating effectiveness of this dual aim is that often the goals of the second motivation are met in the government's efforts to prevent the first. So this is really the heart of what we're discussing today. The only real way that terrorism could conceivably destroy the Constitution would be if the United States government broke the limitations and thereby violated the rights articulated in this document. Now, there are those that would tell you that this has already happened, that our current administration has so zealously attempted to prevent future attacks, the first goal of terrorism, that the second goal has long since been accomplished. I don't think this is where we stand. And if I did, I probably wouldn't have agreed to speak today. On the one hand, it's quite depressing, and on the other, if my rights were already being violated, I'd probably be scared to stand up and say what I'm saying. But as I said, I don't believe that we're there yet. But there are also those that tell us that we're nowhere close to this fine line, and that anyone that says that we've crossed it might as well be a terrorist themselves. And I consider this position to be almost as untenable as the first, because when we remember that the only way that terrorism can destroy our Constitution is if the government oversteps the limitations articulated within it, then almost as dangerous as the actual violation of rights is the inability to concede that they could be violated. So is there a middle ground between these two positions? Let's revisit our fable for a moment. But this time, let's change the character, the main character, from a boy king intent on amusement to a lifeguard. And the lifeguard cannot tell the difference between a dolphin and a shark. He has the interest of those he was hired to serve at heart, but his inability to distinguish between a man-eating predator and a harmless, similarly colored mammal has resulted in a lot of people on a hot day unable to enter the water. Some of the beachgoers want to call the lifeguard company and get the lifeguard replaced with one who is far less zealous. And in fact, only a few days ago, there was a wonderful lifeguard who was content to actually nap on the stand. At the very least, it would be nice to get him back on the beach, or someone related to him. But others angrily replied that it is better to be safe than sorry. Far better to mistake a dolphin for a shark and be a bit uncomfortable in the heat than to mistake a shark for a dolphin and be very uncomfortable decomposing in its stomach. So there are two sides in many ways that these polar opposites efficiently epitomize the issue before us today. One side might tell you that the moral of this particular fable is there is no value to liberty in the stomach of a shark. But the other side might identify it as there is no worth to physical safety if liberty is threatened. And I think both are wrong. And since I wrote the fable, I get to choose. The moral is that the best beaches for swimming are those where the lifeguard is also a trained marine biologist. So think about it. The philosophical debate about liberty versus safety is rendered neutral if the one that is hired to protect our safety is committed to precision in identifying threats. As school children, in addition to learning about fables, we also learn about the Constitutional Convention and the blood and sweat and tears that our founders put into creating the document that precisely articulates the rights that God has given us. In uncomfortable conditions, they worked long hours to ensure that the Constitution did not approximately cover the issues, but it precisely, no more and no less, protected the people and established a government that could stand the test of time. And thus, it's not surprising, really, that our most effective weapon in defending the Constitution against the threat of terrorism is not a tank or a rocket, but a commitment to precision in identifying our threats. All too often, we're too quick to use the word terrorist interchangeably with words like Muslims. The most common method of dealing with Islamic violence today rests on the belief that violence and Islam are interchangeable. We support democracy to the extent that secular parties are elected, but then we do all that we can to ensure that no Islamic parties are given the same opportunity for success. I had the opportunity to live in Cairo for a time last year, and while I was there, I met with a number of members of the Muslim Brotherhood. This organization was established in 1928 with the goal of teaching young Muslims that there's more to Islam than praying 5 times a day. It's since evolved into a very influential organization, and it's true that it has served as a breaking point for many of the organizations today that are rightly called terrorists. But this organization has been very adamant in the last 40 years to stay away from violence and to articulate moderation in Islam. And yet members of this organization, which is committed to this peaceful change, are routinely terrorized by their own government. While I was there was a wave of arrests, and people that I would have called my friends were actually taken into prison, tortured, and they remain there today. The Egyptian government makes no effort to distinguish between the moderate brotherhood and the more dangerous radical movements. But our government historically has not made that distinction either. If we can't see the difference between peaceful Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the dangerous al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, or if we topple the Taliban but make Mubarak's Egypt the second largest recipient of foreign aid in the world, our war on terror can't be won. We spend huge amounts of money on precision rockets to ensure that we hit only military targets. But then we carelessly refer to the Brotherhood and al-Qaeda in the same breath. Anyone that has taken a class with Joe Kikasola in the School of Government has probably heard his theory about the 2 Islams. And anyone that has engaged in a short conversation with Dr. Kikasola probably knows that he is the embodiment of precision in language. He has studied the hermeneutics of the Quran to conclude that not all Islam is violent. There are moderate Muslims, and we must engage in dialogue with them if we are serious about securing stability in the Middle East. So we need to bring this back, as I conclude, to relate to our Constitution and its susceptibility to terrorism. So to do that, let's return to our discussion of what the Constitution actually is. We said that it is an articulation of rights that are granted by God and an effort to protect citizens from a government that would encroach upon these rights. But implicit in the idea of limited government is the assumption of a capable people. Thomas Jefferson once said that whenever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. But how can people be well informed if the government is not precise in the articulation of threats? If our foreign policy allows for no distinction between moderation and extremism, then how should our citizens? And if our citizens are ill-informed, then according to Jefferson, don't they lose their ability to be trusted with their own government? And if they lose their ability to be trusted with their own government, doesn't our Constitution lose its purpose? But all is not lost. As I said earlier, I wouldn't have agreed to speak today if I thought that it was. There was an article recently in a small newspaper that said that the Bush administration was considering meeting with key figures in the Muslim Brotherhood to try to identify some common ground, and this is a great first step. But the second step comes from in the form of more advice from Jefferson and echoes a little bit of what Dr. Parnell was saying earlier. He said, enlighten the people, this is Jefferson, not Parnell, sorry. Enlighten the people generally, and tyranny and oppressions of body and mind will vanish like evil spirits. I believe the human condition susceptible of much improvement, and most of all in matters of government and religion, and that the diffusion of knowledge among the people is to be the instrument by which it is effected. The beauty of our Constitution is that we don't have to wait for the government to be the source of our information, any more than it is the source of our rights. We can make an effort to inform ourselves. We can read widely, we can ask questions, and we can challenge assumptions. I don't mean to suggest that in so doing we'll find that there's no such thing as terrorism, or that Islam has nothing to do with it. There is, and it does. But I do suggest that we can become more informed about what distinguishes a shark from a dolphin. And in doing so, we'll be able to enjoy liberty and safety, and maybe even an occasional day on the beach. Thank you.
Our final speaker today is Stephen Haney. He is a supervisory assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia in the Norfolk Division. And in case of you out there who feel that you're not getting your money's worth with your tax dollars, let me explain to you what Mr. Haney has to do with the number of other responsibilities he has. One is that he is in the economics crime section, which is basically white-collar crimes. He is the coordinator for the Anti-Terrorism Advisory Council. He also serves on the Virginia Area Maritime Security Executive Committee, and he is a supervisor for the Military Special Assistant for U.S. Attorneys. He received his undergraduate degree at UVA and his law degree at UVA as well. He has served as an assistant Commonwealth attorney in Arlington, Virginia, and he has also served as a assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of West Virginia. Would you please welcome Mr. Haney?
I'm afraid if this was a baseball team, I would be the weak link in the five-man rotation here. But when I got called to do this little speech, it reminded me when I first started here, I befriended an FBI agent, very conservative in his politics, and he got to talking about how much he hated big government. It was Big Brother. And I turned to him, I said, "Aren't you forgetting you work for the FBI and that you are, in fact, Big Brother?" And he saw no irony in that. and I like that. I like the fact that people that are in the position that they are, the executive branch in particular, can feel that way, that they are doing good. They're not Big Brother. And that's kind of the way I look at this issue. The people I work with in the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, the FBI, they are decent folks and they are not trying to violate anyone's civil rights. And to the best extent of my knowledge, I know no one who has done that. That's not to say that it hasn't been done, and it will be done. So we can't rely on our good feelings about our coworkers, because this is a government of laws and not of men. And even though we like the men and women we work with, we can't necessarily trust the ones we don't know. And quite honestly, when you talk about encroachment on the Constitution, you're really talking about the executive branch. And that's where I work, and that's where John Ashcroft worked. And when I watched him speaking, it reminded me, based on what's happened over the past year at the department, how vitally important it is to have the right person in that job. Because he was there when we really needed him. And after he left, things didn't go quite as well. There is no doubt that there are a lot of people in the world, some of them living among us, who want to kill us. There's just no way around that. And as the other speaker said, this may go on for quite some time. People talk about this is a generational war. And unfortunately, when you use the word war and you get into things like War Powers Act and that sort of thing, you have to be more concerned about civil liberties. Let me read a short passage from James Madison, the father of the Constitution, who was also president during the War of 1812, which in fact was the last time our homeland was attacked until 6 years ago. He said, "Perhaps it is a universal truth that loss of liberty at home is to be charged to provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad. Of all the enemies of true liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it compromises and develops the germ of every other. War is, in fact, the true nurse of executive aggrandizement. In war, a physical force is to be created, and it is the executive will which is to direct it. In war, the public treasuries are to be unlocked, and it is the executive hand which will dispense them." And clearly, that is what's going on now. We have a strong executive, and we need one, and the question is, how far is too far? Now, luckily, we have two other branches that should hold their own, and there has been some argument that at least Congress hasn't really done that until very recently, where they started chipping away at some of the executive proclamations and things like that. And I feel that that system of government that Madison and others developed will sustain us. The question is, can it sustain us for 20, 30, 40 years? Whereas and clearly during every other major war, the Civil War, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. In World War II, we interned innocent Japanese citizens, all of which was a terrible crime against civil rights. But in any event, it occurs. Can we stand the burden that long when all the other wars have been, I think the longest war was 7 years prior to this date. I was going to talk a little bit about the Patriot Act, but speaking last, there's a benefit and a burden to speaking last, and it's good that I'm a prosecutor, because sometimes you get arguments and you got to do your closing arguments, and you just take your written argument and you throw it out, and then you address the issue as it is. The Patriot Act, as he's described it, it really, what it does is taken things that were legal for the government to do, law enforcement to do, in organized crime cases and in drug cases, drug organization cases, and applied those to the crimes of terrorism. It's really not that big a deal. They allow roving wiretaps. That's important because with cell phones, terrorists take a cell phone, they'll throw it away, buy a new one. You need things like that. You need to be able to do search warrants and then not notify the person you search right away. You have to notify them later, but sometimes if you notified someone you've done a search, they know what's going on and they run away, they tell their colleagues. So it's things like that that make it very worthwhile and very necessary. So I don't have any heartburn against the Patriot Act, and in fact, we apply it in our work all the time. We've prosecuted a fellow by the name of Musawi here, you probably know about him, up in our Alexandria office. And another thing the Patriot Act does, and I don't know whether he mentioned it, was that now the FBI can talk to the CIA and they can talk to the military. Before that, they were basically not allowed to really talk to each other that much, and that's what resulted in 9/11, or could have been prevented if they were allowed to speak to one another. I had come prepared to defend the Patriot Act and also to talk about some things that really, in my personal opinion, I'm not speaking for obviously anyone but myself, that perhaps we've gone too far. The torture memos, which have been withdrawn, but still they are out there. The incidents in Abu Ghraib. Now, they aren't U.S. civil rights, but it looks bad. I wouldn't say it looks bad. It obviously looks terrible. And when people see us doing that, we get, you're just going down a slippery slope with that. And I think we are now turning that corner. We've gotten the Congress involved. The Supreme Court has been very active here, both supporting and overturning a few decisions. And I think the Constitution can survive given the right people and everyone with the right motivations. Thank you.
Enjoy listening to all of you. My question is really for anybody, but I'm basing it on the comments of Professor Jeffries. I think you articulated very well on the fact that the Constitution does not grant us the rights, but they're based or acknowledges the fact that these are God-given rights, and therefore the government's role is to protect those rights. What happens, though, in times like today when a good number of the U.S. population and those running things in Washington not just refuse to acknowledge God, His existence, or His, I guess, inspiration in the way that He inspired the founders to write this Constitution. What happens when God is taken out? Does our Constitution then thus maybe pose a threat of our rights being infringed upon and so forth?
Well, I'll start out by saying I don't think he'll go quietly. I don't know that our founder, I think that sometimes we, and I don't want to step out of my realm of expertise, so maybe I should refer you to professors of American government, but I do think that our founders did not all agree on precisely who God was. I think that there were certain similarities in their system of beliefs, but I don't think that our Constitution is based on an agreement of exactly who he was. And I don't think that it has to be, because it's the articulation of our rights, but those rights, they exist independently. But it does definitely concern us when you have a government that is maybe less concerned about the God that inspired the government that exists. And if anything, in my mind, that makes it so much more important. Some of the gentlemen talked today about the flexibility of the Constitution and how that is really an asset. And it absolutely is when you have an agreement about the source of it, at least some level of agreement. When that source of agreement is not so much there, I think that's when we have to get back to my original point of being far more precise in what it is that we're doing, what it is that we're violating, who it is that we're targeting. Because if we're not, if we don't have this shared agreement, then all of a sudden you open it up far more to abuse. And so that's why I think that it's so critical that we are very, very careful to articulate what we're doing, who we're hurting by doing it, and who it is that we're going after, because we're not going to agree if we take away that foundation.
Does anyone else have a question?
Yeah, I've got one. With regard to getting down to what really drives the terrorists, I think one of the issues that did not come up here is the fact that this is a religious worldview that we're dealing with. And I question the validity of that there's a moderate Muslim who really, truly believes their religion. From the way I analyze the Muslim religion, you cannot be a moderate Muslim and still believe the tenets that are taught in the religion. Can you please address that issue, especially Ms. Jeffers?
I wish that Dr. Kikasola was given a microphone to answer the question, because I think he does it really well. And we've had this conversation before, Mr. Falcon, that I think that it's very, very difficult. I know that I would be terrified as a Christian to have a Muslim take a look at some of the policies of the Army of God that exists in the United States and look at what they do. This is the organization that kills abortion doctors because they believe abortion is murder, and so they act aggressively to end its implementation in the world. And I would be really, really concerned as a Christian if a Muslim told me, a Muslim incidentally that didn't speak English, or I guess that's a bad example because we have the Bible in so many languages, but the Quran is not intended to be interpreted outside of Arabic, incidentally, so I also get nervous when people do that without being able to read Arabic. But the point is that I would be nervous as a Christian of having a Muslim telling me that he gets my religion better than I do. And I think that as Christians, we a lot of times take the fact that we know absolute truth and we know the gospel, and we confuse that with the fact that what we say then is absolute truth, and what we say is always the gospel. And it's not. There is a gospel and there is a absolute truth, but we can be fallible in presenting that. And so as to whether or not there are moderate Muslims, I don't know if you read the stuff that I sent you after last Tuesday, if you've had any chance to look that over, but anybody else that wants examples of that, or conversations with or whatever, I would love to send that out to you and give you this idea. But I do believe that it exists. I'm not sure, I didn't come prepared with one in my shoulder bag to actually show you, but I do believe that they're out there. Dr. Kikasola talks about the hermeneutics and the different interpretations of one in light of the other. In terms of how we look at the chronology, there are instances that we have Muslims that are working towards democracy, that are working towards moderation, and to just ignore them and say they don't exist means every dorsal fin in the water is a shark, and I don't think that that's a helpful perspective.
That's the issue, I think, that's not being addressed with the Bush administration. People are losing faith in his policies because it's not really addressing the real underlying issue here, which is a religious issue. Pat recently has come up and discussed that more, and Bush has finally admitted that we're fighting an ideology. But we need to get an understanding whether there really is a moderate overall perspective within the Muslim community that we can live with, or if in reality their religion teaches world dominion, which means that what the terrorists do isn't really helps their cause in the long run. That's why they will not speak out about what's happening with terrorism.
Except that they do.
If I could, I'd like to address that if I could. After 9/11, I mean, let's start by admitting and openly assessing that we live in a political world, and so politics are going to play in this. And when we talk about governments, well, we're also talking about politics. So after 9/11, I can tell you that every effort was made to ensure that we did not characterize anything that was going on as a religious war. Every effort. Now, you can argue with that if you want, and it's okay to believe that that was incorrect, because it was not correct. But the fact is that for the leader of the free world to stand up and profess that he's going to lead the nation in engaging in a religious war is not a very sellable political stance to take. And frankly, at the time, I truly believe that the leadership did not believe that it had to be characterized that way. What the leadership did understand is that we had to come to grips with the difference between the moderate elements and the radical elements of Islam. Now, what too few Americans understand, and I'm not suggesting that no Americans understand, I can tell you that millions more understand today than they did 6 years ago, but too few Americans understand the implications of jihad. And what has happened in the Islamic world is that the radical elements of Islam have tried to add the sixth pillar to the 5 pillars of Islam. And if you have never gone to the internet and looked up what the 5 pillars are, I encourage you to do so. I can assure you that as a religious person, that you would not have a hard time understanding their posture in buying into the 5 pillars of Islam. But once you buy into the jihad as the 6th foundation, if you will, that suggests to the radical elements that you must embrace jihad against all people who do not believe in the most radical interpretation of what Islam is. And that is what is really changing the face of the Islamic world. The moderate elements of Islam today are frightened to death to speak out, because they have crosshairs on their forehead when they do so. And that is because inside the Islamic community, they are at war with themselves in a manner in which it is hard for us as Americans to come to grips with. That may not be a pretty picture, but I have come to believe that it's very important to deal with the picture that we really have, not one that we wish that we had.
Okay, would anyone else like to ask a question? Ian, there's a gentleman over here in the front table.
My question is also for Dr. Jeffries. I've done Republican politics for 13 years. I started when I was like 12 years old, and seen a lot of very strange things. And now I'm a religious studies student. I had to throw away an entire life in political science, and I was on Capitol Hill for a while and a bunch of other stuff. And I've heard this topic so much. And I once thought that it could all be solved with large military forces. I was in the Air Force too for 4 years. And now I understand that only Jesus can solve the issue. And I went on a mission trip to minister to Muslims. Our director, Cami, at KPC, was from Egypt, and he tricked me into going because he knew I didn't want to go. And I watched a man from the same mosque where the blind sheikh did his sermons, I guess, I don't know what they call them. And I watched his countenance change when I told him that Jesus loves him. And he argued with us for like 2 hours, but I watched him cry when we explained John 3:16 to this man. In Islam, God does not love them in their mind and their thinking, that they can't understand that God loves them. That's what he told me from his own religion. And this man let us pray for him. And so to me now, looking back on a life of political science, I now understand that maybe missionaries might have more of an answer than we may have given them credit before. And I just don't know. Just after listening to everything, and I just think back on my own experience, watching this man who was angry with us before change, not because of politics, but because we told him that Jesus loved him. And maybe you'd like to comment on that, or how you think that the missions element might be related to solving the problem.
I think your example's a terrific one. I'm not sure what I would have to add, except, I mean, certainly if you look at who Jesus was and what he did with the people that he was confronting and trying to change, he very rarely confronted them head on. I mean, the ones that he confronted head on were really his own people, right? The ones that weren't were the ones that he ate with, that he broke bread with. And lots of people accused him and said that he didn't, understand, and that he was as bad as they were because he was being relativist to some extent, and to say that, that what they're doing was okay. But he didn't. He didn't say it was okay, but he made an effort to understand. And if that's what, the missionaries are doing and you're capable of doing, then I think that that's wonderful. And absolutely, if we can endeavor to understand it on a personal level, then wonderful. I think that's a good start.
Yeah. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you for all coming out today. I appreciate your time. I think it's extremely interesting that we're having this discussion on the presupposition that we're getting all the facts about 9/11, and particularly concerning the fact that Lee Hamilton, the one that was in charge of the 9/11 official commission, came out today recently with a book entitled Without Precedent, where he explains that he was stymied. The George Bush administration stymied him, did not give him the money that he needed. In fact, stopped the investigation before the allotted time that they had been given. And also concerning the fact that George Bush in 2005 said the Constitution is nothing more than a goddamn piece of paper. Also considering the fact that we're on the school, the president of which has written many books warning us about the New World Order. It seems to me that 9/11 would be a very convenient way to usher in the New World Order. And considering this is a Christian university, I think this needs to be addressed. If nowhere else, God help us, it needs to be addressed at this place.
Well, would anyone like to comment on the gentleman's statement? Okay. Megan?
It seems like during World War II, we've had declarations of war. Now, certainly we had a regular nation state to go to war against. And it would take an interesting construct to declare war on Al-Qaeda or radical Muslims, radical Islam. But in addressing many of these terrorism acts and preventing those, in the civil and criminal arena, we've always been handicapped because our Constitution gives you the benefit of the doubt, I guess, except in conspiracy, to commit the crime. For the damage to occur, then we come and prosecute you for doing the wrong. And now we're dealing with such harmful substances and mentalities of people that it seems that our Constitution handicaps us by giving them the benefit of the doubt to some extent to go ahead and commit the crime. Yesterday, I think on the CBN website, they mentioned that a 26-year-old medical student was apprehended in a Dearborn, Michigan park with an AK-47, a military garb, and he had the radical website talking about, jihad and all that. And so as it relates to how we're currently, it seems like we have some military aspect of trying to prevent terror, but at the same time we're dealing with it in our constitutional courts here as a crime, which it seems as though if we were just straight at war with radical Islam or terrorists in general, that we wouldn't be constrained by our constitutional rights. And it giving them constitutional rights or even Geneva Convention rights or military tribunal rights, it's putting lives at risk. Do you think we should change or do anything different in that regard?
Dr. Niemeyer?
Hey, I don't know.
I think you should be all right.
Okay. Let me go ahead and respond to that a little bit. And I think your point was, in the modern era, are we constrained by constitutional limits on how we conduct warfare against terrorists? And I think in some ways we are, but in other ways, it's just the way it is. I mean, it is what it is. It's one of my favorite sayings that I use around the Marine Corps nowadays. It is what it is. you have rules in which you have to operate under, and we are a nation of laws. And I don't believe we're constrained as much as we just have to remember what we can and cannot do. And I'm sure the Admiral would reiterate the same thing, is that there are many times when, as a military commander, especially if you're a senior at the senior level like Admiral Clark was, where you might want to lash out. Like, for instance, when the coal was attacked in Yemen, it would have been very natural for us to just go back in and, well, we'll get the bad guys who did it, we'll flatten Aden. Well, we could have done that, but we didn't do that. And the reason why we didn't do that is because we're a nation of laws and we're a nation of morality. And so as a result, I think that once we go into this war with the idea that, okay, we're going to fight this war, but we're going to do it under certain rules, and we just have to abide by them, that's the way it's going to be. And one of the things that's important to remember is that when we start to abrogate those rules, or we start to hedge on those rules, or we start to cheat on those rules, that's a slippery slope to potentially an anarchic or fascist state in which you'll have a police state established. Well, you know, it's the greatest thing in the world would be for us just to push a button and all things would automatically happen. But that's not the way America is set up. Again, it gets back to my point that I was making with Cecil Crabb and how the Constitution is written. All three branches of government are constantly in struggle with each other for just how the Constitution needs to be defined. And the same way with the way we respond in a military way. I think the days of having an identifiable enemy are long gone. I think we're going to have an asymmetric threat from now until maybe our lifetimes are over. But once again, we have to establish rules in which we operate, or we end up on that slippery slope to anarchy, and probably, you know, some bad things will happen after that.
If I could, I'd just say that's your point. I agree with your point, and it's critical to understand the difference between fighting a war with a nation state and fighting a war against unidentified nations, people that exist within the walls of a nation, in fact, and who are determined to kill you. And by the way, they don't want to do it one at a time. If they had their choice, they'd love to kill 250,000 this afternoon in LA. They think that would be fabulous. Now, that doesn't give us license to do anything, but if we are responsible for national security issues, then it does raise the question, shouldn't we try to know as much as we can about somebody who's trying to do this to us? And so the issues, when I said I don't believe the Constitution is at risk, I believe that some of the current practices and the interpretations that we have decided to apply to particular procedures may change. For example, if we know full well that Al-Qaeda is communicating with cells inside the United States that are existing under the guise of citizenship, if we know that to be true, are we going to ignore that at any cost? If we're going to, we might ignore it at some small cost. That's a value judgment that will be made by people who have a right to choose and a right to decide. I would like to suggest that the greatest risk to all of this might be along a little different slant. If you look at what has made the best part of the world as good as it is, it's the fact that it functions within a community. And so we affectionately speak about the community of nations. If we look at citizens in the same light, and you might think about what it is that causes us to be unsettled about whether or not we will be able to adapt to the environment that we have. It strikes me that one of the things that might worry us is that almost we've gotten to the point that the protection of the individual right is so supreme that we are not able to think and even speak about not the community of nations, but the community of citizens. And it strikes me that there will be a constant tug of war between the community of citizens and individual rights. And that balance, it will be necessary to select leaders who are determined to protect all that is good in the manner in which we practice the rule of government, and do it in a way though, that doesn't protect the individual at all cost as opposed to the community of citizens. And we will select people to lead in our government, to make choices and decisions along those lines. If anything concerns me is that we are not having that kind of discussion. That is the kind of discussion we need to be having in 2008. Because we do face, you nailed it very, very well. The longest war we've actually ever fought is the Cold War, but we don't even talk about it, fighting it in the kind of terms that we're thinking about now. But I remember one day when Don Rumsfeld said, I want to know what those guys are doing on the border between Yemen and Saudi Arabia who are plotting to kill us. How are we, or pick 2 states. And he wasn't talking about the states, he was talking about radical elements that were non-state players inside those institutions, inside those geographic boundaries. And it could have been, though, inside United States and Canada. It could have been anywhere, because the fact is that this is an innovative enemy. And so we're going to, the point that she made and reinforced about adaptability, that is as important as anything that we are facing, that we have tools that are adaptable to the challenges that we face.
Okay, I'd love to continue this discussion, but unfortunately we are out of time. I would like the panel, to thank the panel for coming today and speaking to us about this important issue.